Sam. Do you remember?
21st night, September.
Death Stranding 1's greatest strength is also its greatest weakness. It's too much Kojima.
Did you like it?
Now let me be clear, I really like Death Stranding 1. I liked it when I finished it the first time, and I've cultivated an even deeper appreciation for it over the past 5 years. Also, if the title of this video didn't make it clear, I unapologetically worship Hideo Kojima for his games, his idiosyncratic style, and for being like the only person in history who has never been toxic on social media. When I found out back in 2016 that Sony was giving him free rein to create the game of his dreams with no creative interference, I was not only happy for him, but with all the drama he endured when he left Konami, but I was excited to play a game that would feature Kojima at his most unrestrained. Though I was ultimately happy with the result, the first Death Stranding was a great example of what happens when an auteur is surrounded by yes-men. When that happens, a good auteur will make several positive, progressive decisions that advance the medium forward. Decisions that the producers would have otherwise seen as too financially risky. But often, even the best auteur will make decisions where everybody, literally everybody on planet Earth, will collectively wonder, what the hell was that guy thinking?
Yeah. Like Mario and Princess Peach.
Oh my god! Oh no! Who writes this?
Ultimately, Death Stranding 1 was a brilliant showcase of Kojima's most recognizable talents, as well as several other things that we have come to expect from his games. World building, wholly unique characters, state-of-the-art graphics and sound design, and an innovative, if somewhat polarizing gameplay loop that I and millions of other people love. But I feel that because Kojima was trying to go full throttle with so many new and weird ideas, the game often got in its own way. There were times when I and several other gamers felt that the game's pacing was awful. The world building, though genius in my opinion, was so dense that it often prevented the story's more emotional and philosophical moments from being able to breathe. And those first few hours of gameplay are famously painful to get through. Yes, the gameplay eventually becomes great, but no game should ask you to play for 5 or 6 hours before the rhythm starts to set in. And those are just my primary complaints. With all this said, one might reasonably suspect that going into Death Stranding 2, I would expect more of that unrestrained design philosophy from Kojima, for better and for worse. But honestly, I knew deep down for the past 5 years that Death Stranding 2 would be incredible. I knew that Kojima Productions would listen to the criticism and refine Kojima's original vision to perfection. Now that the first game got all the intricate world building out of the way, the sequel could lean more into the emotion and characterization that we love from Kojima's games. Now that we've gotten used to the gameplay loop, the sequel could iron out all the creases. And you know what? I was right. Death Stranding 2 on the beach is excellent. It is the most cohesive, complete game that Hideo Kojima and his team have put out since Metal Gear Solid Peace Walker. And, aside from maybe Clair Obscur Expedition 33, Death Stranding 2 will probably end up being my favorite game to come out in 2025. That said, while almost all my problems with the first game have been addressed and improved upon, it's still not perfect. The game does have a decent number of minor blemishes, but I am happy to say that none of those things actively impeded my overall enjoyment. I'll get to those minor problems later on. For now, let's start by going down the huge laundry list of things that Death Stranding 2 gets so damned right. But quickly, before I do, I'm happy to say that this review will contain no story spoilers, and any gameplay you see will come strictly from the first half of the game. Now, let's start with the game's most obvious quality, which is the graphics and technical performance. Even the most ardent critic of the first game will admit that both its art direction and graphical fidelity were fantastic. As somebody who played the first game again this past year, there were times where, for a split second, my brain would forget that I was looking at a video game and think I was looking at real life. The only problem is that because the first game looked so good, I had a hard time believing that the next game would make a significant leap forward in graphical quality, especially in a time when there's an emerging consensus that video game graphics have begun to peak. Yet somehow, the game made that leap. A good way to demonstrate this quickly is by doing a side-by-side of the main character Sam from both games. Look at both the face models. If Death Stranding 1 were released today, Sam's face model would be considered very good, but his and all the other face models in Death Stranding 2 are just on a whole other level. But while I think most people would have forgiven Death Stranding 2 if there wasn't a significant improvement in face models, the new game had to take advantage of the PS5 architecture in respect to its environments. In a game where you're going to be spending a lot of time walking or driving from one place to another without a whole lot else going on, you need those rocky fields, mountains, deserts, and waterfalls to look as realistic and high fidelity as you can, to give you that feeling of immersion and healthiness that can only come when you're in nature. Somehow, Death Stranding 2 not only provides arguably the best looking landscapes in gaming history, but it manages to do so without making the back of your PS5 sound like an intake of a jet turbine engine. As soon as I saw the first shot of Death Stranding 2, and how crisp and detailed the mountain was, I was honestly worried that within 10 minutes, my room was going to heat up like a cheap sauna. But it never did. The game somehow manages to look this good, while maintaining an almost consistent 60 frames per second at 1080p on my base PS5. Plus, I don't know if it's just me, but the difference between the game's performance mode at 1080p 60 FPS and its quality mode at 4K 30 FPS is barely noticeable. Like, I could clearly see the difference between these two modes with other graphically intense games like the more recent Final Fantasy games or Spider-Man 2, but with Death Stranding 2, the graphical fidelity is only like 5, maybe 10% better on quality mode, making the performance mode obviously preferable. And guys, let's not forget how fast the game transitions from the main menu to gameplay. God. That makes me feel like Meg Ryan in the diner scene from When Harry Met Sally, dude. The Decima engine is freaking magic, and needs to be preserved in an era where it seems every gaming company on the planet is switching over to Unreal Engine 5. And I say that as somebody who likes Unreal Engine 5, despite its issues with stuttering and frame drops. Though the combination of these graphics with the game's occasional, sweet licensed music drops provided me with an unparalleled feeling of zen, I think the most peaceful feeling the game gave me was faith that Grand Theft Auto 6 will be able to run at 60 frames per second on a base PS5. I mean, seriously, Rockstar, if Death Stranding 2 can do it, surely your game with $1 billion budget can do the same. Now, while the game is a graphical and technical tour de force, it's not perfect. The frame rate will dip slightly during the game's more chaotic moments. Also, I did have 2 crashes over the course of 60 plus hours with the game. The first was a crash to the PS5 dashboard, and the second made my PS5 shut down entirely. Apparently the reason why this happened was because, if I understand correctly, Death Stranding 2's map screen runs at an unlocked frame rate. I don't know why Kojima Productions would do that, but anyway. Because there was one point where I was switching too much between the game and the map, my PS5 couldn't handle it and shut down. Thankfully this never happened again, but still, anytime I switched a bit too much, there would every so often be a consistent 3-second delay during this switch. Aside from those things, the game still remains one of the most optimized and polished games on the market. Moving on to gameplay. Just like in the last game, you play Sam Porter Bridges, the most epic depiction of a delivery man since Moses in The Prince of Egypt. In the hands of any other developer, the concept of a game centered almost entirely on just delivering packages from point A to point B would end up painfully boring. Yet Death Stranding 1 managed to make the cycle of collecting, delivering, and upgrading more addicting than when the first Crackdown game tasked you with collecting all those agility orbs. Thankfully, the core gameplay was so good that it allowed me to overlook a plethora of minor problems. All Death Stranding 2 had to do was iron out those small foibles, and it would become the collectathon of my gamer dreams. And by God, they literally fixed everything, down to the last minute detail. Let's go down the list. You have an easily accessible radial menu that lets you perform every conceivable action so much faster. For instance, remember when you had to go into the first game's cumbersome menu every time you wanted to rearrange your cargo? You can do that in half a second now. Granted, the menus in Death Stranding 2 can also feel cumbersome and overwhelming at first, but trust me, you get used to it before you know it. It's much like the menus in Metal Gear Solid 5 in that way. Second, speaking of Metal Gear Solid 5, Death Stranding 2 adds that game's addictive loop of infiltrating enemy bases, stealing their materials, and redistributing them to rebuild infrastructure. Of course, you could do that in the first Death Stranding, but this game differs in a couple of key ways. Where the first game's enemy bases were mostly just the same camps repeated again and again, the enemy bases in this game have a variety of different buildings and enemy types, which force you to deeply consider your method of approach before infiltrating, and how you might need to turn things around on the fly if you get caught. You can't just easily bowl a gun everybody, for instance, like I did in the first game. You need to consider the enemy types, the guns most effective against those types, and whether you should engage them or try to avoid combat altogether. In short, it's the best of Kojima's two most famous franchises in one. Third, the driving is so much better. Like, here's a perfect example of how much better it is. If the driving in the first Death Stranding was akin to the weighty, clunky driving in Grand Theft Auto 4, then the driving in Death Stranding 2 is akin to the improvement made in Grand Theft Auto 5. Most importantly, for my OCD ass, remember when you drove the reverse trike on the rebuilt roads in the first Death Stranding? Remember how you had to stay in the center of the road because that's how you maintained your vehicle's electrical charge? But you couldn't stay in the center whenever you had to go around a bend? Now you can! Thank you, Kojima. God! I know, it's such a little thing, but that's what I'm talking about. The game addresses every little problem from the first game. Let's keep going. When you want to repair a vehicle, you can do it almost instantaneously now instead of having to store it in your garage and then take it out. The map, it's 3D now, which makes it easier to anticipate environmental hazards. The game now has a day-night cycle, as well as a weather system, which not only keeps the visuals varied and entertaining, but also affects the way you play your game, like when river levels rise, for example. The game has skill trees and upgrades to further incentivize you to help out people as much as you can. I mean, sure, half of the upgrades I didn't use, but the other half are genuinely fantastic and are definitely worth working towards. The best upgrade, by far, is how you can upgrade your trucks with a cannon that can shoot a tether at distant cargo, and then load it onto your truck. You remember how annoying it was to have to drive off-road to pick up a lost item, let alone get off the truck and get back on? Now you can be driving along a road and all you have to do is point your truck in the item's direction and you can get it. I can never go back to Death Stranding 1 ever again unless somebody can mod this cannon into the PC version of the game. On and on and on. Throughout the game, I was constantly reminded of these little things from Death Stranding 1's gameplay that aggravated me, and then I felt so joyously grateful to have them addressed. But by far, the biggest, most significant improvement to the overall gameplay is the pace. As I said at the beginning, I and a lot of other people who played Death Stranding 1 had significant problems with the way it balanced both its gameplay and its story. There often was a lack of rhythm between the long, often exposition-heavy cutscenes and the either short or long stretches of gameplay. Now, I don't mind my long-ass cutscenes. I am a Hideo Kojima fan after all. It just has to feel balanced. As I alluded to at the beginning of this video, I felt the first game didn't develop a healthy sense of pace until Chapter 3, which is like 5 or 6 hours into the game. And even after that, there was a number of instances throughout where I felt the pace was starting to drag. In Death Stranding 2, all those problems are gone. You get into the addictive gameplay loop like 4 or 5 times faster, and I never felt like I was playing too long without any story beats or watching a cutscene too long without getting back into the gameplay. Again, it is the most cohesive game that Kojima and his team have put out in at least a decade and a half. But again, it does fall short of perfection. Though the vehicle handling is significantly improved, you will find yourself stuck every once in a while, and it is annoying. But thankfully, you don't spend as much time trying to get yourself dislodged like you did in the first game. The boss fights this time around are better than in the first game. They're more epic in scope and bombastic, but unfortunately they still don't have those creative gimmicks that the bosses from the Metal Gear series did. But I will say the one major exception to that is the final boss, but I'll get to that in a moment. Some of the weapons don't feel like they have a great deal of impact. But that's mostly it, and these are just admittedly minor nitpicks. Everything else is sublime. I am addicted to this game. Every time I think I'm ready to put down the controller, my subconscious coaxes me to just do one more order. And then it's like, okay, one more order. All right, just one more order, you know? I'm over 60 hours into it, and I am not tired of it yet. I am going to go for the Platinum Trophy, which by my estimation, should take me roughly 100 total hours by the time I'm done. That is great value for your dollar. At this point, I've basically waxed poetic about this game non-stop without any major criticism. But as I transition into the game's story, I unfortunately have to break my streak. Don't get me wrong, I like Death Stranding 2's story a lot. I think it significantly improves upon all the problems I had with the first game's story. That said, a few problems still linger. But before I get to that, I want to keep the attention on the positive for a little while longer. As I said at the beginning, I love Death Stranding's world building. I think it's a genius synthesis of Eastern metaphysics and quasi-scientific realism. However, I felt that because there was so much of it in the first game, it often got in the way of letting the game's more emotional and philosophical moments breathe. But now that the world building was out of the way, Kojima could lean more in the other direction. In that sense, I was proven partially right, because Death Stranding 2 is a more intuitive story. But yet, the game also manages to add more interesting world building without it overshadowing the much needed characterization. Unfortunately, it's hard to explain why without going into spoilers. I'll just say that concepts like bridge babies, the beach, BTs, and the nature of time as they were introduced in the first game are all expanded on in interesting ways in the sequel. On top of this, there are new concepts and organizations that are introduced via the new characters, all of whom are pretty cool. My least favorite addition is probably Tarman, but only because I feel they could have explored his character much more than they did. But I still like him. The two coolest additions, in my opinion, are the Doctor character, who makes a very quick and powerful impression, while simultaneously making the world feel bigger. And the second coolest addition is Neil, also known as Not Solid Snake.
No! That is not Solid Snake!
Without exaggeration, I think the story of Neil, who he is, what his motives are, might be the most emotionally powerful thing that Kojima has written since the ending of Metal Gear Solid 3. No, it's not superior to that, definitely not, but it is approaching. As for the returning characters, they generally have their stories continue in interesting ways. Especially with Fragile, she's kind of the MVP of this entire game. If I were to offer up a criticism though, the storylines for certain characters feel like they didn't get tied up in this game properly. Like the endings were surgically removed at the last minute and saved for Death Stranding 3. If you can ignore that, you should find a lot of stuff to appreciate. And finally, if there's one thing that Kojima has consistently done well throughout his career, it's write a good conspiracy. I'm not saying that the conspiracy in this game is any better or worse than the ones in the MGS games, but it's definitely good enough that it belongs in that conversation. I do have a few other positive sentiments to offer, but unfortunately I can't discuss them without simultaneously acknowledging the faults that they are paired with. So, just as Kojima writes good conspiracies, he usually writes some damned good endgame reveals. In Death Stranding 2, I'd say that there are 3 key reveals that happen towards the end of the game. 2 of them, I think, are fantastic, and I genuinely didn't see them coming. However, the 3rd revelation, I personally was able to see from 10 million miles away. Yet the game plays it off as if nobody could have seen it coming. I really want to know if I'm alone in this, but I can't even say what character or organization it involves without spoiling it. With that said, I will leave a sentence at the bottom of the description box for this video alluding to what that reveal was, and you can tell me if you saw it coming in the comment section. Now, while I do believe that the writing is better this time around, the characters are more fleshed out, and there are more emotional, contemplative moments, there are still some issues with the writing that carry over from the first game. What I found in almost every cutscene in the first game is that when a character spoke, a lot of the lines they spoke felt too artificial, like they became a mouthpiece for Kojima to elucidate the game's world and complex concepts rather than speak lines that the character would actually say. Thankfully, this never became too big a problem, because the actors performing the lines are also talented and charismatic, but it did stop a number of scenes from reaching their true potential. Kojima is at his best when his writing harmonizes exposition and natural-sounding conversation between characters, when he balances the intellectual with the emotional. But with Death Stranding 1, there were just too many times where it felt unbalanced to me. Thankfully, in Death Stranding 2, this isn't a problem the majority of the time. The characters generally speak and interact in ways that feel true to the way that they would actually act. And when they do go into exposition-heavy dialogue, it does tend to feel organic. Unfortunately, this isn't true all the time. And there are a decent number of scenes where things still feel very stilted, and I'm unable to feel as engaged as I should be. I do have one last criticism, but I need to save that for the very end. Please indulge me one last time, as I effusively nerd out over how batshit crazy this game's ending is. Guys, of all the positive things that I have said in this video, they collectively don't hold a candle to the symphony of awesomeness that happens in this game's final 2 hours. The ending is the most Kojima thing that ever Kojima'd. It's like he asked himself, okay, what's the most ridiculous, yet simultaneously the coolest thing I could possibly do? And then how can I top that like 20 more times before we roll credits? That is what the ending of this game is. It's off the freaking chain. No, it's not as intellectually profound as the ending of Metal Gear Solid 2, or as gut-wrenching as the ending of Metal Gear Solid 3, but I think I can safely say that it is the most epic ending that Kojima and his team have ever produced. And yes, I mean that from both a story and gameplay standpoint. So, you probably think it's a safe bet that I want all of you to go out and buy this game. Well, in almost any other circumstance you would be right, but Death Stranding 2 is a uniquely tricky game to recommend. Obviously, if you like the first game, you need to buy this. If, however, you played the first game and couldn't understand in what world somebody would find this walking simulator quote-unquote to be entertaining, or the floating fetus and naked Ritus were just too much for you to handle, then nothing in Death Stranding 2 is going to convert you. Not even the new gameplay elements that are reminiscent of Metal Gear are enough, because the majority of the time, the game is still, mostly, just Norman Reedus cosplaying a FedEx employee where every day is his worst day on the job. Granted, while I do categorize this as a criticism, I do have a hard time picturing how Death Stranding as a franchise could have its Elden Ring moment, you know, like where that game took the Souls genre from a quasi-niche into the mainstream. I don't know what Death Stranding could do in that regard. But anyway, I will say that if you played the first Death Stranding and appreciated some of what Kojima was going for, but bounced off of it because you couldn't get past the first few hours or you wanted more action and combat, then I would highly recommend giving Death Stranding 2 a shot. But if you do, I'm going to recommend that you don't watch the Death Stranding 1 recap on the menu screen for DS2, because it's really just not good at all. Just watch either a summary or cutscene compilation on YouTube and you'll be good to go. So that's my review. What do you guys think of Death Stranding 2? Have you had a chance to play it yet? Do you have no interest? Or did you have no interest but think you might be changing your mind? Let me know in the comments section below. Before you take off, make sure to give this video a like, that helps me out a lot. And speaking of Kojima, make sure to subscribe because I definitely will be reviewing Metal Gear Solid Delta when it releases next month. Until next time, remember as always and as per usual, keep on keeping on.